Hi, everyone. Welcome to Near and Rupar. We will get started in just a moment. Well, thank you for joining this week's episode of Near and Rupar. I'm David Near, publisher of The Down Ballot. My co-host is Aaron Rupar, publisher of Public Notice. We do this live stream every Friday afternoon. We were off last week for taking a day off, and next week we'll be off for Thanksgiving. But this is our normal Friday, 2 p.m. Eastern, 1 p.m. Central Time, and we discuss all of the important stories making news from the top of the ticket all the way on down. And if you are a paid subscriber to either of our publications, the Down Ballot or Public Notice, you can drop your questions in the chat box at the bottom, and we would be delighted to answer them. And this week, like every other week, it's just jam-packed with endless amounts of news. This is always the case in the Trump era, but I feel like that there has been a shift, a vibe shift in the last few weeks, especially after the November elections this year, that of course saw Democrats sweep from coast to coast. And Aaron, you published an excellent piece yesterday from writer David Lurie that was titled Donald Trump, the lame duck dictator, which informed the title of this week's episode. And I thought that was such an interesting concept. And I thought David laid out this case so well, why Donald Trump's power that he seemed to have so much of through much of this year has very quickly appeared to start ebbing. And I think that's just the perfect just jumping off point for us to begin talking about.
Yeah, the crux of David's argument, which I found to be pretty compelling, and there's a little bit of context here. I mean, David and I will, when he's pitching stories, not David Near, David Lurie, the author of this piece. He tends to have a realistic, but his assessment of Trump at various points has been that things are not going as well as maybe they appear. If you follow kind of the public narratives or ingesting a lot of the media coverage. And so, at times I've kind of had to push back against him where I don't think Trump is necessarily always on the ropes to the extent that he seems to think that he is. But, I do really think in this instance, David puts together a number of threads that I do think really bolster his conclusion that Trump is entering kind of a new phase of being a lame duck. And, David starts the piece by observing that after the Senate Democratic cave, was that 2 weeks ago now that happened? The weeks are kind of blending together at this point. But, there was kind of a news cycle of doom and gloom about Democrats, that they weren't prepared to fight, that they had, kind of handed Trump a win even while he was losing the shutdown. And David's argument is that we shouldn't let that kind of obscure the fact that underlying a lot of what happened during the shutdown was a political shift that has really broken against Trump and in a lot of ways is getting worse. And, David points out, and there was actually a segment that I posted the clip just a little bit ago on social media on CNN that kind of bolsters this, that, Trump's polling is at kind of like unprecedented lows right now. Harry Enton of CNN put together a number of polls over the last 10 days where I believe all of them are between like Trump being 14 points underwater to an AP poll that had him at like 26 points underwater. And as David points out in the piece, I mean, when you go into the specific issues, there's really not too many bright spots for Trump. I mean, even on immigration, he's like, over 10 points underwater. On the economy, he's like 30 plus points underwater at this point. And so that's one thing, but, there's been kind of this mentality this year, which I think is, been kind of well-founded of like, man, 4 years is such a long time. Like, does it really matter what his polling is at? Because, we're kind of stuck with them until 2029 anyway. Well, you're kind of seeing that things are shifting after the elections earlier this month, where now the midterms are in sight. Very conspicuously, Ted Cruz has done kind of a soft rollout this week of a presidential campaign where he did a hit on Fox where clearly he had talked, or someone on his team had talked with producers about kind of like, well, it also sounds like you're sort of interested in maybe running in 2028. And he was like, well, I'm not ruling it out at this point. And, but once you kind of hit that stage of things where people are kind of looking toward the next presidential election, the power of a president kind of naturally starts to ebb at that point. So when you kind of combine that, just the realities of the calendar, the fact that when we get out of the holidays, we're going to be kind of in another campaign environment, with the fact that, Trump is really underwater, both on the issues, but also, on his broad approval rating. You really, and then, also with the fact that his policies are kind of actively, I think, working against him and kind of making things worse. Like there isn't a whole lot of economic relief in sight. I mean, there was a jobs report that came out yesterday from September that was better than expectations, but at the same time, it was announced yesterday that the administration is not doing an October report, which they certainly could do and probably would do if they thought it was going to, really reflect positively on their stewardship of the economy. And so, when you put this all together, Trump is kind of, he's already underwater and it seems like the anchor is kind of tied to him and it's getting worse. And so that was the argument that David was trying to make, is that, we're kind of entering a new phase after these elections. The public has rejected Trump. And so even as, we sort of, played the blame game a little bit, although it's in the rearview mirror now over the end of the shutdown and who caved and who didn't cave. Regardless of how that ended, Trump is in a bad position. And to add to this, I don't even think David's piece necessarily gets into this, although I guess he does mention it, that, at the end of January, government funding ends again. So that's another leverage point that Democrats could use, if things really go off the rails over the next couple months. I mean, obviously, we have kind of saber rattling with Venezuela right now. If there are other unlawful actions that Trump takes, where there's a leverage point coming up right after the holidays that that Dems can use to kind of have that fight with Trump again, and it didn't go well for him last time. So there's a lot of reasons to be pretty bearish on Trump's prospects at this point.
I think the points about the polling are really worth emphasizing because I've often heard people say, well, Trump doesn't care about his polls. First off, I don't think that's right. Trump is obsessed with polls. Trump acts in ways that drive his poll numbers down, and he behaves as though he's popular no matter what. But he sees the polling, and when he dismisses it as fake news, it's getting under his skin. But what's much more important than Trump's view of the polling is how everyone else used the polling. And I'm talking from leaders in Congress all the way to ordinary Americans. That when you see that Donald Trump, the would-be dictator, is unpopular, it makes it a lot easier to oppose him. It's very hard to oppose someone who's popular. I think back to right after 9/11 when George W. Bush's polling numbers soared into the 80s and 90s even. And, it felt like, whoa, if you were taking a stance against that, you were extremely lonely, and you were. And it took many years for that to change. But Trump starting off unpopular and getting more unpopular has made it so much easier for people to oppose him. Now, not everyone. There obviously were the 8 Senate Democrats who thought that caving was the better option. But the fact is they are a minority. And so many other people are standing up and saying, no, not this anymore. And we've seen some amazing examples of it this week, most remarkably with the Epstein files. I mean, Aaron, we got to close the loop on this one because we talked about this all summer long, this discharge petition. The Democrats were waiting for the 218th signature. Mike Johnson had kept Congress out of session and refused to swear in Adelita Grijalva from Arizona, the special election winner, because she would be the 218th signature. And you made the argument, and I thought it was very plausible that one of the Republican signatories, they'll probably get to them and have them pull their names. But Trump apparently went on this mad dash to get Lauren Boebert to pull her name off this discharge petition to release the Epstein files, and even bringing her into the White House Situation Room. And she said no. And then from there, things spiraled in a totally wild and unpredictable direction where you basically had Congress unanimously passing a bill to release files that Trump could order released on his own, Trump claiming that he wanted this all along, and then signing this bill. I mean, this is very clearly the actions of someone who completely lost control over the situation.
Yeah, and I should mention I didn't really do David's piece justice in that he also gets into Epstein, which I should have brought up, and his point, which I hadn't really thought of it quite in this context, but not since Nixon has a president been so fixated on keeping documents out of the public view, and of course, as he was talking through this piece with me, Nixon increasingly became obsessed with the Watergate cover-up, and it kind of consumed the end of his presidency, obviously for good reason, because it drove him out of office. And you can kind of see a similar thing happening with Trump and Epstein, where, it's hard to really understand what was going on with the government shutdown unless you kind of put that front and center with the 218th vote and kind of the effort to keep the Epstein files out of public view. And I should admit, because you and I, like you mentioned 2 weeks ago, and probably even further back than that, we're talking about Epstein. And I was pretty cynical, as you kind of alluded to, about the prospect of this actually hitting 218 votes in the House for the discharge position. And then even beyond that, so once Grijalva was sworn in and There was a vote in the House that I think there was only one vote against, which was Clay Higgins, whatever. But then Mike Johnson held a news conference, and it seemed like the cover up was still kind of ineffective. It was only going to take a different form because he talked about, I'm very confident that when the Senate gets this, they're going to make these changes to the bill and they're going to really protect the victims and
Right,
not send
right,
it back
right,
to
right, right.
us. And it seemed like that he had kind of a plan that I assumed at the time he had already hashed through with Thune to, kind of keep delaying, to kind of keep this tied up in the process. And that would be kind of the next stage of the cover up. Well, Thune, they basically ended
Boom.
up, with Schumer's leadership there, but, passing it with unanimous consent through the Senate. So, Thune kind of noped out on using his power to try to, stall things in the Senate. And then, of course, Trump signed it. Now, of course, we need to wait. I think there's a 30-day window where, documents are at the end of that going to be produced. And we'll see, if they try to use heavy redactions to shield people or, Elizabeth Warren was on Colbert last night and she brought up the possibility that, like, if pages are missing, they'll know that there's shenanigans going on. So, I'm still going to be, have my guard up in terms of, like, how much transparency we're going to get here. But there have been a couple times where I've been very cynical about Republicans and how they would actually, whether they'd actually play ball with this and operate in good faith. And so far, there's been a couple interesting points where, the coalition has fractured, like you mentioned with Boebert, Nancy Mace, and Marjorie Taylor Greene in the House, and then Thune in the Senate, who I think had the ability to try to gum up the works a little bit and just opted not only not to, but to basically pass the bill immediately, so it went right to Trump's desk.
So someone was asking in comments exactly about what you were referencing about the possibility of a further cover-up. And we also had a question about the Tennessee special election that's coming up in a couple of weeks. And I absolutely want to get to that. I love that question. But let's put a pin in that one for the moment. I think this is exactly right, Aaron. Thune obviously did not want to be caught in the middle here. He wanted to get this done with and over as fast as possible. And I think Johnson was not expecting that. I think, did you post the clip of Johnson being accosted by reporters? He seemed very surprised when they told him that Thune was not going to do him a solid and try to gum things up, as you put it. And I think that there's no way that this ends with whatever it is they're planning to release. Because I think you're right that there are going to be redactions. There's going to be stuff that's incomplete. And man, even if they released even if it looked as though they released everything, people would still say, "Where's the rest?" Trump has obviously zero credibility. His Department of Justice has zero credibility on this, and it's not just Democrats, obviously, that are driving this. It's Republicans too, and the MAGA base, which was ginned up for years about this particular issue. And what the files we have seen, it's really astonishing that in so many ways, this what seemed like a wild conspiracy theory about a ring of rich elites covering up for a pedophile and perhaps engaging in extremely improper behavior themselves. There seems to be some truth to that, except they just had the wrong people fingered.
Yeah.
And the other thing here is you had this great clip of Senator Chris Murphy from Connecticut. I think it was just yesterday, right? A TV news host asked him, "Well, what if there are Democrats named in the files?" And Chris Murphy said, "So what?" It's like,
Yeah.
you don't. MAGA, I think, misunderstands Democrats' feelings about this. No one on the other side is saying, "Oh my God, we have to protect Bill Clinton."
Right.
Whoever gets screwed by this release deserves to be.
Yeah. And, I do want to temper expectations a little bit for people just in that, this kind of, it came back to mind yesterday. And I posted something on this that, Trump in 2002 was on record in an interview with New York Magazine saying, basically, Jeffrey Epstein is a terrific guy. He's great to spend time with. And it's even said that he likes young women as much as I do, or he likes women as much as I do, especially ones on the younger side. I don't want
Yep.
to, it's something basically like that. So I think it's very possible that whatever is in these files kind of confirms what we already know. I mean, maybe there's a chance that there's some smoking gun, some sort of video recording or something that's just undeniable that will, just cause Trump's political fortunes to crumble once and for all. But I think it's probably more likely that it just kind of, sort of confirms what we already know along these lines, that, they partied together, they were friends, that they caroused together. We've all seen the video of Trump and Epstein at Mar-a-Lago, with Trump doing that kind of weird lip thing, tongue thing that he does sometimes. So it is, it's kind of like that. It's one of the all time, I think, defining tweets of the Trump era. The guy that was posted like in 2015 too, but the one that's like, I'd love to see how Donnie wriggles out of this one. He wriggles out of it. Oh,
Right,
next time,
right.
or it's like he just
Yep,
has this
yep,
way
yep.
of like of always, getting away with everything. So, I do want to temper expectations a little bit that there's already a lot out there. I mean, even these latest email drops from House Oversight, which had subpoenaed the Epstein estate, and there's Epstein's comment about how Trump is the dog who hasn't barked yet. And how he, according to him, get to kind of take this with a grain of salt because it's Jeffrey Epstein saying this, but that he had photos of Trump with young women in bikinis in his kitchen, incriminating at the very least. He could have been lying about it, but the point simply being, there's a lot that's already out there. The documents the files may end up just kind of confirming that, and then it's kind of up to us what we do with that. But I do want to kind of reiterate, the fact that Marjorie Taylor Greene and Trump have had like a full rupture at this point. That's a very significant development because she has a very strong base of support within MAGA. She's been Trump's strongest soldier, going back 5-6 years now, and so. That's something that I think is going to be hard to repair, just given some of the things that she has said and that Trump has said. I guess we kind of went through this with Elon Musk, where it seemed like Trump and Musk had a huge falling out. Now, of course, Musk was at the dinner with MBS and Trump this week. So these things can be repaired. But, that's a really significant thing, much more so than anything Democrats are saying. When you start to have some of Trump's strongest soldiers turning on him, that really does some political damage. So, regardless of what comes out or doesn't come out in these files, the Epstein files have already done a lot of damage with Trump, and that's going to stick with him going forward.
I think that's exactly right, that the contents probably isn't going to matter, but it's kept the GOP so wrong-footed, and they couldn't even enjoy their supposed win on the shutdown for very long because it came and immediately bit them in the ass and is a much juicier story for the media here. And, there is more to the story, though. I think Ron Wyden, the senator from Oregon, Democrat, has been pressing for a release of financial information related to Jeffrey Epstein's corrupt empire. And there, I think, probably really is a lot there, not necessarily on Trump. But the fact is, we still don't really understand and know how Jeffrey Epstein made all his money, how he made enough money to buy a private island. I mean, that's crazy levels of wealth. And there's just no explanation. Seeing these emails, he's obviously subliterate, not a bright guy by any stretch of the imagination, and somehow wormed his way into the graces of all of these ultra wealthy people. And it's something that's still a mystery. And, who knows if Wyden's push right now will be successful. But, if Democrats take back the House next year, then they get subpoena power once again. And that the House Oversight Committee or any number of other committees can start pulling on these threads. And so it's just a matter of keeping the GOP wrong-footed. And I think that it's Democrats have done a shockingly masterful job of this. I have to say, when this first started unfolding earlier this year, I thought Democrats would think that it was icky and boring. And, there was a very funny tweet saying that, Chuck Schumer's, the only files we care about are the Eggstein files, when the price of eggs was everywhere. And it turned out Democrats actually knew how to play their cards right on this one. And so I think that's another underappreciated aspect of this. Every single Democrat in the House, including some very conservative ones who don't like to play, in the muck, all signed on to that discharge petition. So I guess you gotta hand it to them for
you
knowing
do.
how to
It's
do this one.
to the point where I do kind of wonder if, and I'm doubtful about this, if Democrats kind of had an idea that when the shutdown ended, this Epstein story would explode with the Grijalva swearing in, the discharge position. Because the other thing is that, Mike Johnson had put a landmine for Republicans. He set the trap basically, in the sense that because he refused to seat Grijalva, you had to know that as soon as government reopened, the Epstein thing was going to become this huge story again, which led to, the emails that were subpoenaed coming out right away. And so, I don't know if people like Shaheen kind of had that much foresight where that was part of the enticement for winding things down and, caving. But, the news cycle about the cave lasted about 5 minutes. Then it was Epstein, and it has been for like the last 2 weeks. And so I was a little bit surprised, just to kind of like close the loop on this, then we can move on to other things, that, I was out and about. I think that was on Wednesday when Trump, his bleat came across that he's signing the signing the Epstein files, and I actually had posted the screen cap of his post. But then I was getting messages from people who work in Democratic comms like instantaneously, like he's lying about this, he's lying about that. Like, so I made the editorial decision to delete my post and
I
just
saw
say,
that.
yeah, because it really was. You hate to just kind of there was too much there to even like fact check because it was
Yeah.
just like a screed of lies. And sometimes when Trump's lies are so obvious, I feel like they don't really need to be fact checked. But when he's making specific accusations about Democrats who allegedly were involved with Epstein, and people are who are credible sources of mine are telling me that he's lying. That's like, well, I don't really want to amplify this stuff. But anyway, so I was surprised to see that Trump actually went that route. Like I still to the last minute was like, yeah, is he really going to sign this? Like, how is he? What's the end game going to be here? So now, I'd assume that Pam Bondi's probably working overtime right now to figure out how to handle this. What the release is going to be. There was a news conference that happened, I believe, it was on Wednesday as well, which you may or may not have seen, where it was about a totally unrelated thing. But Bondi took some questions at the end, and she was asked about Epstein, of course. And, she had some very specific wording about how she can't comment on active investigations. And this was in the context of SDNY, the Southern District of New York, opening investigations into Bill Clinton and Larry Summers. And it was at least Clinton and Summers. And, Reid Hoffman's name has been up there because Trump brings him up. But I don't know exactly who's being investigated. But so then, that kind of prompted a whole new firestorm of speculation that, well, this is the same play they're going to make to eventually, release some kind of like nominal, nothing that's incriminating or really transparent in terms of what the files actually are, but just something to kind of, have the excuse out there that we tried, but we can't investigate the real stuff, or we can't release the real stuff because it's an active investigation. So all of those plays, I think, are possible for them still. But David, I think you're right when you mentioned earlier that, the public demand is going to be so overwhelming, and people are kind of dug in on their positions now, but I just don't think that's going to be tenable. So that's, I think, again, there's a scenario where the files end up kind of just confirming what we already know, and maybe Trump can survive that. But given the lengths that he's gone to not to release these files, I mean, certainly I think that suggests strongly that there's more there, things at least that he believes are going to be very damaging to him.
Mentioning Pam Bondi, I'm enjoying the thought of her, having to work all weekend, doing redactions. But these guys are such clowns, Aaron, that I wouldn't be surprised if they screw stuff up and wind up failing to redact certain things, or releasing unrelated stuff. I mean, you never know with these guys. But to zoom out a bit from Epstein to Trump's situation more broadly, I think the narrative shift is really worth scrutinizing, because I feel that there is this long-term trend in the traditional media that it only really matters if Republicans turn on Trump. That, yeah, Democrats and even independents giving Trump poor marks, that's to be expected. But just think about all of the zillions of articles over the years from 2017 on, Trump voters and Trump diners still support Trump. And that always seemed to be such an important benchmark for the media. And I think that there are a lot of biases at play behind that. I think that there absolutely involves privileging of white voters, and elevating their views as more important. But I do recall, going back again to George W. Bush, that things really started to get bad for him when Republicans turned against him. And that's when his poll ratings started to really slip, dropping below 50%, and then further and further underwater for the rest of his presidency, and leading up to the disastrous 2006 midterms. And I think Trump losing his grip on the GOP, that's something I can't say I saw coming. I mean, the Marjorie Taylor Greene split, at first I kind of dismissed it. I just thought it was just more kayfabe, more kabuki showmanship, whatever. But it seems to be at least that she's committed to the bit, if it is a bit. And then, Thune basically screwing over Johnson, and the entire GOP, Congress deciding to go against Trump on this one. There are probably some other smaller things that we can point to as well, but it feels to me that could cause the biggest change in the way Trump is viewed by the traditional media if Republicans are finally more willing to go against him. Oh, the Ted Cruz thing, I think, is, there was reporting that the White House is furious at Cruz because I guess they're caping for JD Vance, which
Mhm.
I don't know how happy they are about that, but I guess they feel they have to. So yeah, I think that is going to be the thing to really keep an eye on over the next year, which is how
Mhm.
much do Republicans actually slip out of Trump's grasp.
Yeah, and just one thing to kind of push back slightly, or a data point that I think kind of cuts against the idea that Republicans are really fracturing is, Trump. Um, I was absolutely shocked yesterday when the post came through where Trump was calling for the execution of Democrats. It started. He had one where it was a repost of a guy with an Iron Cross avatar of all things. But then, of course, he followed up later in his own words and said seditious conspiracy punishable by death or something like that.
Yep.
And that was, that should have been like a layup for
Yep.
Republicans, right? To be like, and you had, I mean, Mike Johnson even went as far as to say, like, well, the lawyers are going to have to look at the language of that, and
Yeah.
it's like,
Right. Shut up.
so that to me is still kind of where it's like, if he was really losing his grip, that would have been a very easy one. And I thought Thune kind of had like a very weak sort of like, those weren't the
Yeah.
words I would choose. I wouldn't choose those words or something like that. So, you know, I think we have to kind of keep that in mind that Trump can say absolutely outrageous, impeachable, some of the worst comments ever made by a sitting president. And Republicans are still willing to either defend it, as Marsha Blackburn did, which I thought was kind of shocking in its own right, that, he has a point basically to a Newsmax instead this, or, kind of pretend they didn't hear it or just not comment on it. So he still does have a lot of power within his own party. I mean, there was actually a very powerful comment that went viral of one of the Epstein survivors during one of the news conferences who said, "I voted for you, President Trump, but you've been a disgrace on this issue. You're a national embarrassment." And those are the sorts of things that I think are really powerful because it's kind of it's coming from inside the house, the criticism, and not from the outside. I will say part of the polling that Harry Enton highlighted today on CNN is the biggest thing that has been driving Trump's decrease in popularity and increase in unpopularity is that his standing with independents has gone from like basically neutral in January to like negative 30 something now. So, that's not Republicans, but that still is a part of the coalition that helped him win last year. And it seems like that's already like pretty much gone. I mean, he's in the gutter with independents, and Enton ascribed this to the state of the economy, which kind of checks out given, it seemed like cost of living was a big thing last year and it hasn't gotten any better this year. So, I guess the next stage from that would be Republicans cracking a little bit. We've seen that at least on Epstein. Even Cruz, in kind of rolling out his presidential ambitions, didn't really criticize Trump at all. He was basically just kind of making his own case, and I'm sure he's careful. He's careful not to criticize Trump. But I will say, if you can dig it up, I posted it back when Trump was first asked about the Cruz thing, which was like a week ago, or maybe it might have even been earlier this week. But this was during one of the Oval Office events, and Trump looked genuinely surprised. When a reporter was kind of like, I don't know if you saw, but Ted Cruz went on Fox and was talking about running in 2028. And he
Really?
was like, yeah. And you could see his brain kind of working because he started with like, Ted is a good friend of mine. We ran against each other a number of years ago. And then he almost had to catch himself. He was going to call him Line Ted, but he kind of stopped short. And he was like, that campaign worked out well for me. Look at us now. We're in the Oval Office. So, he kind of went through the whole process of like, I'm going to play nice. I want to attack him. I'm not going to attack him, but I'm just going to kind of, obliquely refer to the fact that, we already ran against each other and I beat him once. But, I think that is, because Trump, I will say, and I don't want to get too far afield, and I do want to get to the Texas stuff here too, but there was all this speculation going back years that Trump, was going to run for a third term, and certainly I was pretty persuaded by that, based on when Trump was really kind of floating the trial balloons earlier this year. He has kind of backed off that, and he's been pretty direct that like, the Constitution says I can't run for a third term. But even if he doesn't run for a third term, he's going to want to remain kind of the kingmaker of the GOP. Like that's a big part of his power is that he kind of owns the Republican Party. And so, Ted Cruz running is kind of a challenge to that. So we could see kind of like a proxy war. I don't think JD Vance is going to run unopposed in the primary.
No.
So I'm sure part of the primary to come ahead of 2028 is going to be, is this still Trump's party, or could there be some sort of an insurgent upstart, or someone who breaks from Trump, who's already like a Ted Cruz, who's an establishment figure, who can kind of wrest control away from him. So I think that's part of the dynamic going on here too.
Yeah, and I want to emphasize to your earlier point, at most, we are seeing small cracks emerge, not
Mhm.
major fissures, not major departures. But I do want to say with one thing, since you mentioned the polling, if you look at just approve versus disapprove, that can mask some changes below the surface. And folks like G. Elliott Morris and others have pointed out that Trump's approval rating among Republicans has actually switched a bunch from
Hmm.
strongly approved to just somewhat approve. And those are usually, usually you're asked strongly approve, somewhat disapprove, strongly disapprove. And usually the first two and the last two are combined. And that makes sense when, pollsters share their numbers and when people plot trend lines. But it is important to keep an eye on the difference between strongly and somewhat approve. And you have seen a decent number of Republicans move from the strongly camp to the somewhat camp. And that's how this works. That, if Republican voters are really at any point going to abandon Trump or stay home in the midterms, it starts with the small shifts away. You don't immediately rush to the other side and say, I was all wrong about everything,
Hmm.
go Chuck Schumer.
Right.
I think that that's one sign to keep an eye on. And you mentioned the Texas thing, which is the other big topic that we had to talk about. And it really is remarkable to see just how badly Donald Trump's attempts to rig the elections in 2026 are going. As
Hmm.
folks very likely saw earlier this week, a federal court in Texas issued an astonishing ruling blocking the GOP's new congressional gerrymander, which was designed to target 5 Democratic held seats, saying that it was a racial gerrymander. A racial gerrymander just means that map makers are sorting voters based on race. That you see some white voters, you put them in this district. You see black voters, this district, Latino voters, this district. And that's flagrantly illegal. That violates the 14th and 15th Amendments to the Constitution. You cannot deliberately divide voters up by race. And Republicans were, this opinion was remarkable to read because Republicans could have just said, oh, yeah, we're following Donald Trump's directive to add more Republican seats. Because partisan gerrymandering, the Supreme Court has said, federal courts can't weigh in on that. But racial gerrymandering is still illegal. And Republicans, I guess, needed a hook to hang their hats on to say, oh, we're not just doing this purely out of partisanship interests. We're trying to correct, improper racial gerrymandering. But that they engaged in racial gerrymandering to do that. And now we don't know what's going to happen. The case is going to be appealed to the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court could do absolutely anything with this. But this is a completely separate issue from the Voting Rights Act, which we can get to later if we want. And there's a chance that this gets upheld. And if so, my God, Donald Trump sparked this redistricting war and could come out the massive loser. I think that there was no way Republicans were ever expecting Democrats to fight back as hard as they have. California, especially, we saw the resounding win for Prop 50. Virginia is on the verge of doing something similar. It would be really something if Democrats wind up netting more seats out of all this.
Yeah, and I appreciated in your piece about this at the down ballot that you led, really early in the piece with the fact that the judge who wrote this opinion in Texas is a Trump appointed
Yes.
judge, which I think is kind of remarkable. I'm assuming he was a Trump 1.0 appointee,
Oh,
not
yeah.
like a
Yeah.
more recent one, but in any event, because it's he even has some like scathing remarks for Harmeet Dillon, who's a DOJ official,
Yeah.
and maybe because that was a part of it that I guess I hadn't like fully made that connection that Dillon wrote a memo that kind of gave up the game that this was like a racial gerrymander, and that was cited in the judge's ruling because essentially the Texas Republicans did what Dillon wanted them to do or was asking them to do in this memo that she wrote in the summertime. So how did that? Yeah, maybe explain that connection because
Yeah.
I hadn't read that anywhere else, and that was interesting to me.
Oh, yeah, that was absolutely the centerpiece of this judge's opinion, Judge Brown. And he is a very conservative Trump judge. But he thought that the Republicans were engaged in bullshit, and he called them on it. So this letter, Harmeet Dillon, she is head of the DOJ's Civil Rights Division, and she sent this letter to Governor Greg Abbott and Attorney General Ken Paxton in Texas, both Republicans, of course. And it was filled with such crap and such nonsense. And at the end, she threatened litigation if Texas didn't redraw its map. And Judge Brown had this like really arch and funny and scathing line in the opinion where he says, it's hard to unpack the DOJ letter because it's filled with so many inaccuracies and misstatements and typographical errors. And I'm like, oh, you go off, slay.
Yeah.
And uh, and so what this letter said was, this letter came up with this absolutely cockamamie notion that if you have a congressional district that's not majority minority, but where two or more minority groups together make up a majority, Harmeet Dillon claimed that the existence of such a district alone is unconstitutional, which is obviously insane. Especially Texas is an extremely diverse state with large Black and Latino populations, growing Asian American population as well. And so, of course, you're going to wind up with districts where you have these multiracial, multi-ethnic coalitions representing a majority, maybe even a wide majority in a district. And the only thing that was relevant here was that there was a court, the Fifth Circuit Court of Appeals, which Texas is in the Fifth Circuit, ruled not that long ago that under the Voting Rights Act, that states are not obligated to create a coalition district. States might be obligated to create a district based around a single minority group, but not a coalition district. And so Harmeet Dillon turned this into, oh, coalition districts are illegal and you have to dismantle them.
Hmm.
And it was completely cockamamie. And then this is the amazing thing that Brown pointed out, that pretty much to the letter, Texas Republicans did exactly what this letter, what this letter from Harmeet Dillon asked. I mean, pretty much they followed almost every instruction that she gave them. And you can't do that unless you're engaged in blatant racial gerrymandering. And, the judge pointed out that the resulting districts all were like 50.01% Black. I mean, the kind of, super precise numbers that are only possible, if you're paying too close attention to race while you're drawing these maps. So, yeah, Trump's DOJ tried to give Texas Republicans this hook, like I said, to be able to claim that they were redistricting for nonpartisan reasons, and it wound up completely biting them in the ass. And I gotta
Hmm.
say, it's a glorious thing to see.
Yeah, it is. And, I wonder, because your piece got into this a little bit too, where the filing deadlines for some of these districts in Texas are like really coming up soon, right? Like
Yep.
beginning of December, something like that. So is that something that the Supreme Court would be mindful of in a situation like this, that they need to sort of get involved before it's too late? Because how would that even work? I mean, if you're trying to determine where you want to run for Congress and you're not, so for now, obviously the districts remain the same as they were last, in 2024, last year. But depending what the Supreme Court does, I mean, they could revert to what the Texas Republicans wanted to do. So how would you even handle that if you're, one of these Democrats who's in like an endangered seat, or a Republican who's running in like a redrawn map? That just seems extremely challenging and almost impossible to, just to figure out a plan of how you would handle that.
Yeah, it's an excellent question. And there are a lot of ways that courts go about handling this. The Supreme Court they could say, well, it's too late for a court to rule against this map. This is sometimes you hear it referred to as the Purcell principle. Purcell is the name of a Supreme Court case that stood for this vague proposition that courts shouldn't step into the election process when it's close to time for an election. And Judge Brown addressed this at great length in his opinion, saying basically, given how late Republicans passed their map in the election cycle, if you take a certain absolutist view of this Purcell principle, it would become literally impossible to get a legal remedy because Republicans delayed so long. I mean, what are you going to wait till the day before the filing deadline to pass a new map and then say, oh, sorry, it's too late. Oopsies, you can't challenge. Look, the Supreme Court still could come in and say that this is too late. And you have to wait until 2028 to get any satisfaction, if ever. Another possibility is they can delay the filing deadlines on primaries. This is something we actually see a lot. Um, it happened a lot during COVID when a lot of primaries were delayed and filing deadlines were also delayed as a result. But it also happens in the cases with redistricting litigation. In fact, it happened in Texas the previous decade and is possibly a reason why Ted Cruz became a senator, because there was redistricting litigation in Texas following the 2010 census, and they wound up delaying the primaries that year as a result. And Ted Cruz wound up running in this runoff in the middle of summer in Texas, which is a terrible time to hold an election, obviously. And turnout was extremely low. And Cruz wound up beating the establishment candidate, and the rest is history. But that's just a little bit of color and aside. So yeah, they can definitely delay the primaries if they like. But right now, as of right now, the new GOP gerrymander is not in effect. And obviously, everyone in Texas politics is waiting to see what happens. But if if the ruling holds up, then they'll run on the previous map. And you gotta remember, the previous map was also extremely gerrymandered, just somewhat less so. But it would be extremely good news for Democrats if this ruling holds up, and I think it definitely could. This racial gerrymandering issue is something that actually usually conservative judges are the ones to complain about it. So in theory, the conservatives on the court have every reason to say, oh, Texas did something wrong here. We'll see. Usually they prefer to help out the GOP, but we'll see.
Yeah, there's a question here from Wendy that I think you in your coverage of this touch upon. So I'll bring it up here. She asks, so would the destruction of the Voting Rights Act not impact the redrawn map because of coalition districts? Of course, there's a case before the Supreme Court right now that would dismantle what's remaining of the Voting Rights Act. But I think you already, in some of your comments and in your writing, addressed this, and correct me if I'm wrong, that the judge here actually cited the Constitution and not the Voting Rights Act, right? So I don't necessarily think that what the Supreme Court does would have, in this separate case, would have bearing on the Texas situation. Is that right?
Yeah, so Wendy's actually asking a slightly different question. You're absolutely right, though, Aaron. That so there's this other case out of Louisiana where, as Aaron was mentioning, the Supreme Court could wind up completely gutting what remains of the Voting Rights Act. But no matter what happens in that case, it really can't have an impact on the Texas case because the Texas case was not ruled on based on the Voting Rights Act. Plaintiffs, I think, did make some arguments based on the VRA, but the judge only ruled on the basis of the 14th and 15th Amendments. So totally separate areas of law. That said, this is a huge what if. It's really too much to get into on this chat, but if the Supreme Court does wind up gutting the VRA, then all kinds of districts are going to be basically the GOP can carve them up. And so those are districts that are currently protected by the Voting Rights Act, which are generally majority minority districts. They don't strictly have to have a majority. That's not the standard, but they usually are. And so these minority districts would be completely vulnerable if the VRA is shredded. The coalition districts already lack that protection, according to the Fifth Circuit. The protection of coalition districts, it's not a completely clear-cut matter. I would be surprised to see at this point any court out in the land saying coalition districts are protected under the VRA. But look, if the court rules against the VRA, we'll have a lot to say about it then. I'm a little hesitant to predict. I know a lot of people are very down on this possibility. I'm certainly pessimistic. But let's see what they do. And Aaron, I know we only have a few minutes left, but we had that question earlier about the Tennessee special I think we should get to.
Sure.
So, as folks may know, December 2, right after Thanksgiving, there is a special election in Tennessee's 7th congressional district. This is a conservative seat in Middle Tennessee that the GOP heavily gerrymandered, but it's possible, just possible, that this gerrymander could come back to bite them in the ass because there used to be one blue district based around the city of Nashville. And after the most recent round of redistricting, Republicans carved up Nashville between 3 districts. And so that gave them an extra red seat, but it also meant adding a lot of blue turf from Nashville to these other sprawling rural districts. And one of them is the 7th district. Democrats are running State Representative Afton Bain. Republicans have a guy named Matt Van Epps, who was in the state cabinet of Governor Bill Lee. And something really interesting happened this morning, Aaron, which is that the House Majority PAC, which is the top Democratic PAC that gets involved in House races, the biggest spender in House races on the Democratic side, just said it was putting in $1 million into this race with about 10 days to go. And there's been a lot of reporting that Republicans are panicked about this seat. They're nervous. They have been spending heavily. They've already spent well over $1 million. I think we'll probably see a lot more spending pile in at the last second here in this race. It's still a long shot. This is a district Trump won by 22 points. Even Democratic polling has had the Republican up. But the fact that Republicans are sweating yet another special election in a Trump plus 22 seat, they should not have to be worried about this. And so even if Democrats don't flip this seat, look, flipping this seat would be just an unbelievable upset. Pay attention to the margin, because if this one is close at all, if this one is within the single digits, that is just bad freaking news for the GOP.
Yeah, well, that's a hopeful note to wind it down on today. Trump is still meeting with Mom Donnie in the Oval Office today. last I'd seen before we hopped on this call, it was listed as closed press, which is kind of bizarre because if anybody's been watching Fox News today, they've been using kind of like almost WrestleMania style hype where it was like Trump versus soda. It was like a socialist
show.
showdown.
Yeah, I saw that.
It was really over the top, and I wanted to, DM one of the producers, basically like the cameras aren't even going to be in there. Although Trump in the past it doesn't really matter how they designate these events. Trump can decide last minute to bring the cameras in, and then they will be covered. But it'll be interesting to see. MBS was just in the White House this week, and maybe with the exception of Putin, I had never seen Trump gush over a leader in the way that he did. So I'm assuming Mamdani will get more of like the Zelensky treatment. But, he's really able to hold his own. So I'm very intrigued to see how that goes if the cameras are rolling. So I don't want to be late for that. So we're going to leave it there for this week. We will not be on next week because of Thanksgiving. We'll be back the following week, which maybe after that special in
Yep,
Tennessee.
right after that
so
special.
We'll have one way or the other. We'll have some stuff to talk about there. And if you enjoyed our conversation about redistricting, David had phenomenal coverage of that in the Down Ballot this week. So please sign up for his newsletter. If you like the conversation about Trump, that's the sort of stuff that we write about at Public Notice. Sign up to both of our publications if you enjoy this. And allows us to keep doing the work that we're doing and allows you to ask questions of us in future episodes. So hope everyone has a good Thanksgiving. We'll see you here same time, same place in 2 weeks.
Bye-bye, everyone.